Welcome back, Twisters, and hey there, hockey fans. Nick here, and today we're going to grade every NHL team based on their moves that they made during the NHL trade deadline. So, of course, I want to know your thoughts in the comments below. Who are your winners and losers? Also, let me know how your favorite team did. And remember, I'm not an NHL insider whatsoever. I'm just a dip with an opinion. So let's see what you guys think of my opinions, and I'll see what yours are as well. And if you enjoy all things hockey analysis, history, and culture, I welcome you to join our growing hockey community here on YouTube. So hit that red subscribe button down below and the thumbs up that helps others like you discover this channel. Let's roll into it. I'm doing reverse alphabetical order for this. So we're going to start with the Washington Capitals. So their main moves were the acquisition of Marcus Johansson, a former Washington Capital, and defensive specialist Johan Larsson. He's just played on a couple of crappy teams, but he is very good defensively. And all they had to give up was a fourth for this year's draft. Daniel Sprong, a 2023 third-round pick, and a 2023 sixth-round pick. Overall, they didn't really do a whole lot to augment their roster, but with their veteran core of players and the fact that they've been performing a lot better as of late, Vitek Vanacek has performed well in net, I thought they did a decent job. So I'm going to give them a B- overall. The Winnipeg Jets did a lot. They acquired Mason Appleton from the Kraken, so he's back to being on the Jets. 2 conditional 2022 second-round picks, some other depth picks for the next couple of drafts, and some prospects. So they dealt away Andrew Kopp, Brian Little, so that contract is now off the books, and Nathan Beaulieu, and a couple other depth picks. Overall, I thought this was a nice way to kind of approach a retooling for the Winnipeg Jets. They've seen a lot of turnover this year. So overall, I'm going to give them a B+. I think that this looks pretty good overall. So then that way, Mason Appleton could potentially fill the void left by Andrew Kopp, and they get those conditional second-round picks for this year. Okay, the Vegas Golden Knights, not a very good trade deadline for them at all. We actually saw that the Evgeny Dodonov trade has been rejected, or at least for now. So really for Vegas, this has not gone over well at all in the second half. The Jack Eichel situation isn't working out tremendously. They do have a ton of injuries, but for right now, Vegas is struggling to even stay above the playoff line. So for this, I'm actually going to give them a D. This has not panned out for them very well at all. The Vancouver Canucks kind of had to stand pat at this trade deadline because we don't know if they're going to make the playoffs or not. Connor Garland was a name that had been kind of rumored, as well as JT Miller, but they didn't deal away any big players. Travis Hamonic was the biggest name to go, as was Tyler Mott, and in exchange, they basically received Travis Dermott. But for Tyler Mott, all they got was a 2023 fourth-round pick. I think that Tyler Mott's defensive capabilities warrant a better return than what they got, so I'm going to give them a C-. For the Leafs, of course, they got Mark Giordano and Colin Blackwell from the Seattle Kraken, but they did forfeit a couple of draft picks as well. A second round for this year, a second round for next year, and then they gained a third for this year, but they lost a third for 2024. Overall, though, really, was that enough when your backup goaltending hasn't been particularly good? Is a 38-year-old veteran blue liner going to help you guys when you're just turning the puck over all the time? I really don't know for the Leafs. I don't think that this was enough at all. I know that they were entertaining offers in exchange with the Blackhawks for Marc-Andre Fleury, so I personally will be pretty critical of them. I'm going to give them a D+. For the defending champion Lightning, so they acquired Brandon Hagel from the Blackhawks, also got Nick Paul from the Ottawa Senators. Those are their biggest moves, but they did have to cough up a couple of first-round draft picks. These are conditional, but that's a first for 2023 and for 2024, in addition to some depth pieces. At the end of the day, they do have some depth scoring there with Paul and with Hagel, a guy who I really didn't know too much about, but at a heavy price, that's kind of what you have to do at the trade deadline. I'm going to give them a B-. I think that this was a decent deadline for them, but we'll see if these guys can measure up to what they had acquired in previous deadlines with guys like Barclay Goodrow and with Blake Coleman. So overall, not too bad. For the St. Louis Blues, they did one thing that I thought was absolutely necessary. They got themselves a second pairing or third pairing defenseman in Nick Leddy, but they did have to cough up a 2023 second round pick in addition to Oscar Sundqvist. That was the big pieces of the deal there. Leddy hasn't been quite the same since he came from the New York Islanders, so for this move, I'm going to give the Blues a little bit of a harsh grade here. I'll give them a C, but I still like the rest of their roster, so they didn't have to do too much. I just think that maybe they're not going to get the same value that they paid for. For my team, the San Jose Sharks, I will be critical of them. So they did acquire Kaapo Kähkönen, goaltender for the Minnesota Wild, and they also got a couple of depth draft picks in that deal and for Andrew Cogliano. So they lost Cogliano. They lost Jacob Middleton, which I wasn't really a fan of considering the Sharks are pretty thin at that left-handed defensive position, especially since Mario Ferraro is out for the year. They also lost goaltending prospect Alexei Melnichuk, who wasn't really much of a fit there. Overall, I'm going to give the Sharks a C- here. The Kakkonen goaltending acquisition could pay dividends for this team going forward, but they didn't really do much to get rid of a couple other players that they could have dealt, like Alexander Barabanov and goaltender James Reimer. So I think it was a big missed opportunity for the Sharks. They did extend Tomas Hertl a week or so ago as well. For the Kraken, I have to tip my cap to general manager Ron Francis. He lost a ton of roster players: Kalle Jarnkrok, Mark Giordano, Colin Blackwell, Jeremy Lauzon, Mason Appleton, Marcus Johansson, to name most of them there. But he gained a ton of draft picks, and hopefully he has the capital in the offseason in order to rise above the cap floor and spend money kind of building out the roster. So he got 3 second-round picks for this year. He got 2 third-round picks for next year. He acquired additional picks. I see 2 fourths, a 6th, a 2024 third-round pick, a 2024 7th-round pick. So he did get the assets that he needs. Seattle will be all set in the draft. The Seattle Kraken have done a nice job. They could be a totally revamped franchise or revamped roster going into next year. So I'm going to give the Kraken an A for this one. For the Pittsburgh Penguins, their biggest acquisition was Ricard Raquel, in addition to depth defenseman Nathan Beaulieu. And they didn't have to give up all that much overall, so they lost a 2nd for this year's draft, in addition to a 7th. They lost Dominic Simone and Zach Aston Reese. But I think of what the Pittsburgh Penguins needed to do the most here: get a middle 6 winger, and they got their guy in Ricard Raquel. So I'm going to give Ron Hextall and that team a B+. The Philadelphia Flyers are certainly going to get a little bit younger now that they have dealt Claude Giroux, Justin Braun, and Derek Brassard. So they shed themselves of some of that age. In addition, they get prospect or young NHLer Owen Tippett, kind of a reclamation project, in addition to a 2023 third-round pick. Actually, they gained 2 of those, and a 2024 conditional first-round pick. They could have maybe gotten more for Claude Giroux, so I'm not going to give them the highest mark here, but I'll still give them a B. The Ottawa Senators didn't do a whole lot in this trade deadline, and I think that kind of makes sense. So even though I'm not giving them a high grade for the deadline, I think their roster could be set for the foreseeable future. They did acquire Travis Hamonic. I was a little bit scratching my head regarding that move, but they didn't give up all that much. A 2022 third-round draft pick. Also, Matthew Joseph, Zach Senyshyn, a couple of depth draft picks go over to Ottawa. Their biggest losses were that third-round draft pick and also Nick Paul. I'm giving Pierre Dorion here a C-. I don't think it was a great deadline, but I don't think it was all that bad. It's just that the deadline wasn't very relevant for the Ottawa Senators this year, I don't think. Maybe an opportunity to deal 1 or 2 younger players on that roster that they didn't get done, but it wasn't like they were expected to be big players here at all. The New York Rangers definitely had themselves a trade deadline, so their acquisitions include Andrew Kopp, Frank Vetrano, Tyler Mott, and Justin Braun. Those were the biggest pieces. And then they dealt away a couple of draft picks here. So 2 second-rounders for this year. They were both conditional. That was part of, I think, the Andrew Kopp deal. I'm seeing a couple of 4ths, a third-round pick, a couple of prospects and depth defensemen in the AHL. But overall, this was kind of the best way to round out their roster, I think, going into the home stretch of the season and into the postseason. I like Andrew Kopp. He's a very underrated sort of middle 6 center. They got the veteran defensive presence that they needed in Justin Braun. Tyler Mott is a defensive specialist at the forward position. So I'm going to give the Rangers an A on this one. Chris Drury did a really nice job at the deadline. I don't follow the New York Islanders all that intensely, but guys, why are they extending Zach Parise and 34-year-old Cal Clutterbuck? And this team has been very, pressed for cap space. So I don't really understand why they didn't make any moves there at all. They're just going to be an older team based on what I'm seeing with this roster. So with that said, I'm sorry, Lou, but I got to flunk you, buddy. Like, really, on the surface, this does not look like a team that understands the direction it's going in. Nashville ended up adding Jeremy Lauzon and Alex Biega, so basically depth defensive pieces. But for Lauzon, they had to give up a second-round draft pick for this year's draft. I think that was a little bit too much for something that wasn't necessarily their biggest issue. What I thought was their biggest issue was backup goaltending, and they didn't address that whatsoever. So I'm giving David Poile and company a D on this trade deadline. The Devils didn't really have much to deal at this year's trade deadline. I thought that maybe they could have dealt somebody like Damon Severson or one of their younger forwards, a guy like Janne Kuokkanen, but they didn't get that done exactly. All they did was deal Nathan Schnarr, in a very snarly move in exchange for the Hamburglar Andrew Hammond. So I don't really see what the Devils were doing in this deadline. I'm giving them a C-. Kind of like Ottawa. I'm not really sure what their goal was with this deadline. The Montreal Canadiens were pretty active at this deadline, and of course they dealt away Tyler Toffoli earlier this season, so they dealt away Ben Sherratt, veteran defenseman. Same thing with Brett Kulak. Arturi Lehkonen, I do like him quite a bit, but they got good assets in return, so they got a conditional second for this year and a conditional fourth for this year. They also got a conditional first for next year and a second for 2024, in addition to some other pieces. So very solid for them overall. I'm giving Kent Hughes and the Canadiens staff an A-. The Minnesota Wild were very big players at this year's trade deadline, so they of course acquired Marc-Andre Fleury from the Chicago Blackhawks for a 2022 conditional second. It could become a first. They also acquired Tyson Jost, tough guy Nick Delorier, tough defenseman Jake Middleton from my team, the Sharks, and also a 2022 second-round pick that was really nice. They dealt away the signing rights for Jack McBain, the prospect. They dealt away Kaapo Kakkonen, so we'll see if Fleury can at least perform better than Kaapo did, but he wasn't bad for the Wild at all. They also lost a 2023 third-round pick, But overall, I think the Wild did pretty good with this deadline. We'll see if Fleury can kind of rekindle some of that magic that he had with Vegas. Chicago wasn't exactly the best environment for him to thrive in. The, of course, defending Vezina Trophy champion there. And you added a little bit more thump, a little bit more nastiness with guys like Delorier and Middleton. I'm going to give Bill Guerin and the Wild an A-. The LA Kings didn't really have to do too much at the trade deadline. They're basically playing with house money. They are ahead of schedule. They're very comfortably in the playoff picture. And so all they did was they got Troy Stecher to kind of fill in for Mikey Anderson, who was placed on injured reserve. All they had to do was give up a 7th-round pick. They didn't do anything else, but the Kings have a lot of younger pieces to look forward to in the future, guys like Turcotte and Byfield. So for that, I'm going to give Rob Blake and the Kings a solid B+. The Florida Panthers made the biggest splash at the trade deadline, arguably, by acquiring Claude Giroux from the Philadelphia Flyers. They also acquired Ben Sherratt from the Canadiens. Robert Haig was a depth defensive pickup with the Sabres, and some other pieces, including Yegor Korshkov, a former, I think, second-round draft pick from the Max Domi deal, in exchange for the following. So here's what Florida lost. Frank Vetrano and Owen Tippett from their normal roster, a conditional first for 2023, a conditional first for 2024. I do think they might have overpaid a little bit for Claude Giroux, but I still think that they got what they needed to really push for that Stanley Cup run, especially while they still have Jonathan Huberdeau. We'll see what happens with his contract talks. Overall, this looks pretty good for Bill Zito. I'm a big fan of the moves that he's made ever since he assumed that position. I'm going to give him a B+. The Edmonton Oilers, I don't think really did enough at this trade deadline, especially when you look at the goaltending situation. They added Derek Brassard and Brett Kulak, and this is a team that still needs a little bit more depth scoring. Of course, they had added Evander Kane earlier in this season, but they lost a conditional second for this year, a 4th for 2023, and a 7th for 2024. They didn't give up all that much overall, but I still think that they could have done a little bit more to better their chances, especially for a team that needs to win a round or two this year in the postseason. I'm going to give them a C-. The Detroit Red Wings did a decent job, I would say, at the trade deadline. So they dealt away Troy Stecher for a 7th. I thought they could have gotten a fair amount more for him, but they did get a 2nd for Nick Leddy. Essentially, they also dealt away Vlad Nemesnikov for a 4th-round draft pick. Not the best in return, but overall, they gained Oscar Sundqvist, a 2nd-round draft pick for next year, a couple of depth draft picks as well. I'll give Steve Yzerman here a B-, but of course, the future looks very bright for the Red Wings. The Dallas Stars did what they had to do in acquiring Scott Wedgwood, goaltender from the Arizona Coyotes, because, of course, the only healthy goaltender they have right now is Jake Ottinger, and he's almost being ridden into the ground at this point. They had to give up only a 4th-round draft pick for him, and they dealt away a 4th-round draft pick for Vladislav Nemesnikov. I don't think he's going to solve the fact that the Dallas Stars are still a one-line team. He should help at least, but I don't think that's going to be necessarily enough for this team. However, they are still very much alive in the playoff picture, so they didn't give up all that much in order to at least get into the playoffs. I will give Jim Nill and company there a solid B. Joe Sakic did a very nice job at the trade deadline here, so he acquired defenseman Josh Manson from the Anaheim Ducks. That helps when Bowen Byram is getting back into the lineup, or at least getting back onto the ice now and in a non-contact jersey, so you like to see that. But they still get a veteran, experienced defenseman in Manson. They got Andrew Cogliano and Arturi Lehkonen, helps them with the penalty kill. It's gotten better as of late, as one commenter had pointed out in one of my videos. Cale Makar has been one of those reasons why, actually, playing a little bit more on the PK. But you do help augment the PK with forwards like Cogliano and Lehkonen, and you did have to give up a second in that Lehkonen deal, but I think that was still pretty good nonetheless. That was the biggest piece that they lost. Of course, they swapped Nico Sturm and with Tyson Jost, but overall, this helps the Avalanche. They didn't need to bolster their roster all that much more, and so with that said, I'm going to give Joe Sakic an A-. Chicago gained quite a couple of assets in exchange for Brandon Hagel, a guy who Hawks fans like quite a bit, but I still think when you fetch 2 conditional first-round picks for this guy, and also you get a 2022 conditional second for Fleury that could become a first, I think Chicago made out pretty well in this overall trade deadline. They also dealt away Ryan Carpenter, but they got a couple of other roster pieces like Kachuk and Radish who could potentially fit into the bottom 6. I'm going to give Kyle Davidson, new general manager over there, a solid B+. The Calgary Flames are interesting because they've basically won the Pacific Division at this point. They didn't do anything to augment defense or goaltending because they haven't really needed to do that at all. Instead, they got Kalle Jarnkrok, boy Kalle from the Seattle Kraken. I think that was a really good addition there. A very versatile forward who can fit into the middle 6. He can play center, he can play the wing. And so they had to cough up a decent amount. They got a 2022 second round draft pick, a third for next season. A 5th and a 7th were also pieces that they lost. But for an experienced forward like Jarnkrok, who's been part of Stanley Cup final runs in the past, and Ryan Carpenter, who could fit into the bottom 6 if need be, solid for Brad Treliving. I'm going to give him a B+. The Columbus Blue Jackets had me kind of scratching my head. They didn't really deal away all that much with the exception of Max Domi, but I don't really think they got that much in return. They did get Aiden Hrashuk, who is a prospect, I think from Boston College, but that was just about it. I thought that maybe they would have tried trading away maybe even somebody like Jack Roslovic, honestly. I know he's from Columbus, so they think of him as part of the franchise going forward. I thought maybe they would have entertained offers for Gavrikov on the backside or Jonas Korpisalo, who's been part of trade talks for almost like a couple of years now. So with that said, I'm not really a fan of what I saw out of Columbus. I'm going to assign them a D+. The Carolina Hurricanes and Don Waddell have me scratching my head once again. They did get Max Domi, but for a team that's very deep at the center position and extending Kotkaniemi for an 8-year deal, I don't know if that was necessarily the best move for them. As I've said in the past with Carolina, they need more nastiness. I thought that a guy like Nick Delorier would have fit very well into their bottom 6. They need somebody who is the aggressor in a forward position. So I'm not a huge fan of what they did. At least they didn't have to overpay that much for Domi at all. They lost a couple of prospects in Aiden Hrashuk and Yegor Korshkov, a former 31st overall draft pick. But Don Waddell has proven me wrong in the past. So for all I know, Domi could fit in very well with a bunch of jerks. I'm going to give them a C for right now, but you guys can roast me all you want. The Buffalo Sabres didn't really do too much at the deadline. All they did was deal away Robert Haig. I thought that he could have fetched more than a 6th round draft pick for this year. So with that said, I'm only giving Buffalo a B- here, but we've already seen that the assets in exchange for Jack Eichel have performed fairly well with guys like Alex Tuck and Peyton Krebs, and you also see how that's augmenting the players around them too. So B-, but that doesn't mean that they've been doing a poor job with the season overall. The Bruins landed Hampus Lindholm, one of the biggest defensive pieces dealt at the trade deadline, and they were able to extend him on an 8-year deal. So he and McAvoy, I don't know if they'll play together this year, but for the foreseeable future, they could be the top pairing for the Bruins. Now, the biggest pieces that they lost from the trade deadline include the following: a first for this year, a second for 2023, and a second for 2024, in addition to some other assets. So they did cough up a lot for a very good shutdown defenseman. Overall, it's a fine deal for them. I'm giving them a B-. Maybe it wasn't their biggest need at the trade deadline. I thought that maybe they would try to add a little bit more punch into the middle 6, but they've gotten more contributions from the second line recently. So hopefully that continues to pay dividends for them going forward. The Arizona Coyotes were a little bit troubling at the trade deadline, but they still have a lot of draft picks for the future, so I'm not going to criticize them all that much. So they acquired a 3rd for next year, a 4th for next year that is conditional, the signing rights to prospect Jack McBain. Brian Little actually joins them as well to help them, I think, get to the cap floor for the foreseeable future. They lost Scott Wedgwood, but they extended Carl Vejmelka. I think that was actually a very smart move for them. They also lost defensive specialist Johan Larsson. They lost a 2022 second-round pick for the signing rights to Jack McBain. Overall, I'm going to give them a C+. I'm not entirely sure what they were trying to achieve with this, but looking at their draft capital for the future, I think that's very good for them. And lastly, we have the Anaheim Ducks, who, if there is a team that won the trade deadline, at least from the seller end of things, I think it might have to be the Ducks here. And this is coming from a Sharks fan, ladies and gentlemen. So check this out. So they lost a lot of pieces, of course, starting with Josh Manson, who went to the Colorado Avalanche. They lost Ricard Raquel to the Penguins. They lost Hampus Lindholm to the Boston Bruins. And they lost Nick Delorier to the Minnesota Wild. But that said, you look at the strides made by guys like Jamie Drysdale and Trevor Zegras. You have Isaac Lundestrom there, Maxime Comtois. You have plenty of good young pieces on this club already. They weren't expected to be in the playoffs this year, but maybe a year or 2 years from now. And then you look at the draft assets that they gained. Check this out. They got a first for this year, a second for this year, 2 second-round draft picks for 2023, and a third for next year, and 2 seconds for 2024. This team could be absolutely loaded in the foreseeable future. I think they'll benefit from the moves that they've made. And for the time being, they can at least put Dominic Simone into the bottom 6. They can have Zach Aston Reese if they need to as well down there. So Anaheim, Pat Verbeek, new general manager there. Fantastic job. But anyway, guys, I want to know your thoughts on your favorite team and also who are the winners and losers from this trade deadline. So let me know in the comments down below. Let's have some conversations down there. Stick around because I have all sorts of content planned for the rest of the regular season in addition to live streams. And of course, we'll have all sorts of content around the postseason as well. So make sure you stay in the loop, hit the red subscribe button and the notifications bell. See the video description if you want to follow me on social media or pick up some snazzy Twisted Wrister hockey merch. We have a new line of Rivalry Series coffee mugs that are pretty damn funny. So anyway, check those out. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, leave a thumbs up, and I'll see you around for more content throughout the rest of this season, the postseason, and beyond. I appreciate you Twisters so much for tuning in. Once again, I'm your guy Nick, and I'll catch you later. Ciao.